fascinating because we live in a day and age where you can get away with talking to yourself. I mean, you think about it. We all have conversations that are running in our head and through our head. Maybe it's just me, but that's my perspective. Is I am constantly thinking about and processing and having conversations in the back of my head. Sometimes it's one voice, sometimes it's two voices, sometimes there's like three people in my head that are like arguing back and forth. In fact, I was at coffee the other day with a friend of mine, and the conversation came up, and he asked, said, Scott, do you ever leave a conversation? Do you ever leave a meeting and in your head you internalize, you begin to try to pick apart the conversation, what you should have said, what you wish you would have said, what you said, and you're like, oh, I wish I could retract that. And I mean, honestly, I think we all feel that way. You have a lecture you got to present, you're having a difficult conversation with a peer or somebody you know, and we all begin to internalize. We begin to try to figure out, did I say it right? Did I have the right conversation? Is there anything I left? Oh man, if I could have had it over again. But all of us, we tend to have conversations within our head. And eventually what we're trying to do is we're trying to get down to a big question as to why? Why? Why did this happen? Why did this have to be? Why is this my reality? And isn't it true that the more personal it is, the more we feel the need to put forth a reason why it happened? And we work really hard to try to create reasons and to create a reason why something difficult or something happened. We try to create a narrative. We try to create narratives that allow us to see what's happening, that allow us to find reason in the midst of what is oftentimes randomness. Well, maybe this is just me, and thank you for entertaining me, but I mean, the most personal, the most difficult, the most challenging scenarios that we find in our life, isn't it true that we try to find a reason why? And oftentimes we're grasping at straws, but we need that reason why. So here's something I want you to think about. And this is when it comes to that idea of why, I mean, this is something I found that's really undeniable. I mean, it's this idea is that we create and often we abide by our own self-imposed narratives. That in our head we create, and many times we abide by these self-imposed narratives. And whether they're accurate or not, we begin to live by it. We begin to run by it. We begin to align our lives in such a way that is running with these self-imposed narratives. And that can be a problem. And the reason that can be a problem is because when we begin to listen to those narratives and allow those narratives to really take shape, it can lead to us becoming our own worst enemy. You see, we're in the middle of a series. Last week we began it online. If you missed last week, I'd encourage you, go check out our YouTube channel as you can catch up with what we're communicating and talking about. But you know, one of the things we're talking about is how not to be your own worst enemy. And I know many of you, you've seen individuals that when you look at their life and you kind of look from 15, 30, from 10,000 feet, you begin to say, oh man, you messed up. You've seen people that have undermined their marriage, have undermined their finances. You've had people in your life that have undermined their job, trying to cut corners, and it got the best of them. And many of us, whenever we see this happening to other people, we tend to think, well, I would never do that. That could never happen to me. But you know, you certainly have the potential to be the one that undermines. I mean, after all, as we talked about last week, you have participated in all your bad decisions. I mean, I wish that weren't true, but maybe that's not true of you, but that's true of me. Every bad decision I've made, guess what? I have participated in it. And as we also said last week, that a single bad decision is always the first step towards becoming your own worst enemy. So what we want to do over the next couple of weeks, last week and next week and today, is we want to look at preemptive habits. Habits that we can put into play to ensure that we don't become our own worst enemy. And last week we looked at preemptive habit number 1, which is basically this: we need to pay attention to the tension. We need to pay attention to the tension that's within. I mean, many times we've been faced with a decision or a choice, and there's something inside of us that we begin to wrestle with. We're like, wait a second, that doesn't seem right. There's something not right with this decision. But many times in those tension moments, we push forward because we're like, oh, we can make it happen. We put on our Superman cape and say, you know what, we will make a way. But oftentimes when there is a tension, when there's a check in your spirit, when something inside of you doesn't feel right, that is a time to hit the pause button and for us to collectively just to breathe and say, wait a second. I want to pay attention to that tension. And in this week, our habit that we want to look at is this, is to pay attention to the narratives. Pay attention to your own personal narratives. And we've all had narratives in life. I mean, when you think back, some of us, this might not be as long ago. For others of us, well, just begin thinking. I mean, when you were in high school, we all had narratives, didn't we? I mean, narratives around our parents, right? I mean, your mom and dad. I mean, can you think about as a junior in high school and having to abide by the rules that your mom and dad had? And I'm looking at my dad right here, because in high school, right, our parents are just never quite as cool as we want them to be. They're always just a little bit on the dumb side. I mean, they don't understand your life, right? And then when you turn 18, 19, 20, 30, you have kids of your own, you're like, oh my goodness, they were geniuses. Right? Or when you're in high school, I mean, oftentimes, and this is probably real relevant with students today, but school just seems like a waste of time. Like, are you kidding me? Like, why are we going to school? What is the purpose of this? What is the point of this? But yet, when we begin to think about it, our parents and the educated people around us, those in the school, the teachers and individuals that are making decisions for us, oftentimes they know what's best. And when we begin to listen to them and not necessarily feed the narratives that life is so crazy, school is so boring, my parents are so uncool, when we begin to step back and look at the wisdom in the midst of it, we can begin to see that there's something beyond our narratives. But to make it a little more personal, we all have narratives. I mean, you think about the narratives that we have, and these are internal that oftentimes help shape the decisions that we make. I mean, narratives like this: I deserve better. I'm entitled to. I should be further along than this. I'm not happy. He should be. If she really loved me, they don't even care. It doesn't matter. It won't make any difference. I don't do exercise. I mean, that's probably a accurate narrative, and it's okay. Like, we can just leave that one in play. You don't worry about that. I can't. You can't what? I just can't. I just can't do that. I won't. It's not going to happen. I can't. I'm better than that. I'm better than them. They're all losers. It continues on. They don't deserve. If they would just try harder, I just can't resist this. Something's wrong with me. I can't live without. Republicans are all. Democrats are just, right? Like, we have these narratives that run in our life, right? Men, are you kidding me? Like, they always do the same things. Women are all. Maybe if you have a religious background, Baptist, Catholic, you just think about it and it stirs frustrations and angst in you. If my dad had only, if my mom hadn't, Southerners, Californians, I mean, anybody from California? I mean, it's fascinating, right? We all have these narratives that are working in our head. We all have these narratives that are helping shape the decisions that we make. And the truth is that none of these narratives are really rational or make sense. You see, what I found is narratives help create excuses. And not only do they help create excuses, but they help create justifications. Justifications for why we behave one way, why we treat other people the way we do. They create excuses within us to encourage us to continue to do the same things we do and to continue to live by and abide by the same narratives we have. They empower us to avoid things we should not. They fuel They feel pride, racism, prejudice. They feel hatred. Sometimes they fuel an inner animosity towards certain things. Most importantly, they blind us to our inner dependency of others. You see, false narratives are difficult to overcome. And here's why. Because they are shaped by where we are in the world. You didn't have any choice in that. They're shaped by where we are in the world. They're shaped by the way we experience the world. And they're shaped by the way we were raised in the world. And in so many instances, there's nothing we can do about those. The narratives we have are just shaped by these several things. I mean, our narratives are fueled by our successes. They're fueled by our failures, by our family. They're fueled by the work that we have, the work that we lost. They're fueled by the people that influence us, and they're fueled by the people that we have allowed to influence us. And all these things shape our inner narrative. They shape what's going on inside of us. They shape how we make and process decisions. You know, and a whole lot's been written about this idea that your internal narrative will shape who you are. And the truth is, if we're not careful, the internal narratives that we have, they have the potential to become your own worst enemy. If we listen to the narratives long enough, they have the potential to stir within us the wrong decisions, to make the wrong choices, to make the wrong long-term decisions, financially, maritally, friendship-wise, work-wise, that can ultimately undermine or potentially become our own worst enemy. So, you know, the Apostle Paul had a little bit to say about this. And Paul, he was an individual that I love. In fact, Paul was a guy that was so ferocious about following Jesus and wanting people to follow Jesus as well, that he literally gave up everything. If you are one that's in here today and you're one that you hate Christians, you think all Christians are just crazy, the Apostle Paul is your man. In fact, he lived in that boat. He hated everything to do with following Jesus, but then all of a sudden, he became a follower of Jesus. He experienced Jesus in a completely new way, and it turned his life upside down. To such a degree that he went all over the Mediterranean rim, starting churches, creating churches, and in the midst of this journey, he found individuals that had their value system and their reality was completely shaped, almost antithetical to who Jesus was, what Jesus was trying to create. And so when he writes this letter to the church at Corinth, he begins to use, in this little portion, he uses military terminology. He uses military terminology, and the reason he does is because he wants not necessarily to show us that we've got to go to war and go crazy, but more than anything, he wants to communicate the importance it is for us to pay attention to the narratives, for us to protect against the walls that we build around our own ignorance, to protect against the walls that we build around our own frustrations, to protect the walls that we build around the hatred we have of others, the opinions that we run with others, oftentimes based on false assumptions. He's encouraging us to run away from, to use military terminology, that these walls must be destroyed when we sense them coming up, when we sense them beginning to build within us, when a narrative begins to roll up and we've got walls around us. He's encouraging us that we need to destroy them when it comes to anything that would get in the way of us following Jesus. You see, Paul understood that in order for us to really become the followers of Jesus that he wants us to be, that we need to embrace the idea of changing our value system to following after Jesus. That we've got to rebuild our value system around what Jesus loved and what Jesus poured into us. And so when Paul was writing to the church at Corinth, he was writing to a group of grown-ups who had narratives that looked like this, that people are property. I mean, the people he's writing to at the church at Corinth, the idea of women being second-class citizens, children being underneath, the idea of slaves being a part of their reality, that they just understood that people were property. People had no inherent value. They understood that might makes right. Whoever has the scepter makes the rules. Whoever is the mighty one in the room, they get the ability to tell whatever is right. They are the rulers of the day, that there's no going back, that Ultimately, the gods determine the fate of individuals. So Paul is leaning in and he's writing to a group of individuals whose worldview has been shaped by these. And here's what Paul says. He says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does." Though we live in the world, we don't wage war as the world does. It sounds a little bit violent, but though we live in the midst of it, we don't work towards and try to make war with, but internally we must demolish arguments. I mean, we've all had those arguments that come up in our head that create narratives that begin to justify our decisions, that justify our point of view. We've all found those arguments within us that he's saying we must demolish them. In other words, we are to wage war on flawed conclusions based upon false assumptions. We're to wage war on false conclusions that are based upon false assumptions. So he continues on. He says, we are to demolish arguments in every pretension. In other words, the idea of the lofty, this idea of the high places, this towering conceit, this presumptuous idea that I've got it all together, that I've got the arrogance that it takes to overcome. That we must demolish arguments in every pretension that sets us up against the knowledge of God. That we are to assault any narrative that stands in contrast to what God has revealed in Christ. And he goes on a little bit further and he says, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. This idea of taking captive every thought. When a thought comes into your head, that we're going to take it captive, which is kind of an interesting warlike word, that we're jumping in. A thought pops into our head and it's like, okay, I need to real quickly just run it through. Like, does this line up with what Jesus' value system, what it shows? We take captive every thought and we bend it in and we bring it to conformity of what Christ would have us do. That we take every attitude and we edit it to that of Jesus Christ, which is fascinating. Which, in order for us to really know, this is why reading the Gospels, reading the accounts of Jesus is so critical. Because as we read the accounts of Jesus, we get to learn who Jesus is and what he's done and how he responded. We get to see how he treated people who were nothing like him. We get to see how he loved even when it was difficult. We get to see what he did. In fact, in one account near the end of Jesus' life, he's meeting with his disciples. And Philip, one of his disciples, he leans in and he asks Jesus this question. He says, Lord, show us the Father that will, sorry, I'm having trouble reading. Show us the Father and that will be enough for us. I mean, he's right. For many of us, if we would just get a chance to get a glimpse of who God is, if we could just get a glimpse of God in his entirety, I mean, that would incredibly shape our worldview. And Philip understood that. And Jesus smiles and he responds as only Jesus can. He says this, don't you know me, Philip? Even after I've been among you for such a long time, which Philip's probably like, yes, I know you, but you're the closest thing we've ever seen to God. So, like, could you just show us the Father and quit giving us all these lectures and showing us all these different signs and miracles? To which Jesus goes on and says, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. Do you want to know what God's like? You say, watch me. Listen to me. Learn from me. Do you want to know what it looks like to be a follower of Jesus? When we lean into the life of Jesus, it can create a life-giving narrative. It can be so liberating. We begin to create correct assumptions. We begin to change our attitudes towards other people. And Jesus, on the other side, would just open up his hands and say, would you follow me? Would you follow me? One of the things that I firmly believe is that following Jesus will make our life better and it'll make us better at life. And the reason I believe that is because when we begin to follow Jesus, we begin to take on his values, his vision for the world. And what it does is it begins to create a life of less regret, a life of greater joy and greater hope, even though sometimes life isn't always up and to the right. See, he says, follow me. He says, follow me and you'll see the world. And isn't it true that The world is broken. If we will follow him, we'll see that the world is broken, but God redeems broken things. If we'll follow him, if we will begin to choose to follow after Jesus, we'll begin to see that you matter to God. And not only you, but the you beside you matters to God as well. When we follow after Jesus, we begin to realize that being full of yourself leaves you empty, but emptying yourself will make you full. You see, Jesus came to say things like this. He would say, everyone who hears my words and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Anybody who wants to follow after me, if you hear my words and you put them into practice, you don't just let them go in one ear and out the other and do what you want to do. You don't just take the narratives or the assumptions of life. Like, we don't just learn from God and then just push it to the side and say, I've got my own narrative, I'm going to run with this. But if we listen and do as he says you will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Such a firm foundation. You see, if you don't, you ultimately will become your own worst enemy. And we've all seen that in our lives. And Paul closes, he closes this portion out back in 2 Corinthians. And he talks about something that at times can be easily misunderstood or taken out of context. Listen to what he says. He says, and we will be ready, going back to that military terminology, that idea that we're going to be ready, like we're going to be ready to take on the fight. We're going to be ready to take captive every thought. He says, and we will be ready to punish. To punish what? To punish every act of disobedience once your obedience is complete. You see, we should be ready to react swiftly. To react swiftly when the narratives around us begin to rise up and create walls that push people out. We should begin to respond quickly whenever we see narratives that come apart, that come around us and begin to create justifications or excuses for us to treat other people wrongly. So, here's what I'd like to do for a second. I want us just to get a little uncomfortable with that. Is okay. Because I think inside all of us, and me included, there's some narratives that we've created. Narratives that have created justifications around our own lives. And so what I want to do is I want to just ask you a couple questions. I want to ask you a couple questions, and I want to encourage you to think about what is the narrative behind the question. I want you to be aware that there is a narrative in the midst of it. I want you to think about this because behind everything, there is a narrative, right? There's a narrative behind just about every single thing in life. I want to ask you some questions. I want you to be honest with yourself. Why won't you call your brother? Why won't you call your sister? Your mom? Your dad? Maybe it's not somebody from your immediate family. Maybe it's somebody from the family you raised. Why won't you call your oldest son, your daughter? Why do you drink so much? And when people ask you about how much you drink, why do you get uncomfortable and you begin to push them away? Why do you allow that narrative to begin to push others around? Let me ask you this. Why did you move in with her? Why did you move in with him? Why did you file for divorce? What was behind that narrative? What do you tell yourself? Well, what do you tell yourself when you begin to think about it? What do you tell yourself when you begin to ask yourself why you aren't so generous with your money? Why is it that I keep running things in? Why is it that I don't like giving things away? What do you tell yourself when it comes to you trying to do workarounds on your taxes, trying to get as much money as you can and stick it to the others? What do you tell yourself when it comes to why you despise Republicans? What's the narrative behind why you are so upset with Democrats, with rich people, poor people, with black people, white people, brown people, immigrants? what is your story? What are you telling yourself about why you walked away from church? Why you pushed God out of your life? What are you telling yourself? You see, we all have these narratives. And what happens is when we begin to put these narratives in place and we begin to get uncomfortable with these stories that we're telling ourselves, we begin to find that our narratives really don't hold up to the values that Jesus put in place. In fact, how do your narratives stand up to this? For God so loved the world. You, the you beside you, the you that doesn't look like you, the you that doesn't vote like you, the you that you hope you never have to see at an HOA meeting. Like, for God so loved all the you that he gave his only son. What happens to your narratives when you begin to read this? That you are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. You see, it is our intention that we've got to pay attention to the narratives that we're allowing to creep into our lives. We've got to pay attention because our mission is we've got to demolish the arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we've got to take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. Last week, if you were tracking with us, we shared a commitment that I hope that we've been able to put in practice. But today specifically, as it comes to paying attention to the narratives, there's a commitment I want to encourage you to think about. And the commitment is this: I will demolish every narrative that conflicts with the value system Jesus introduced, or the value system introduced by Jesus. I will demolish. I love that war terminology, the military terminology that Paul put into play. I will demolish every narrative that conflicts with the value system that Jesus introduced. See, ultimately, this is what it looks like to follow Jesus, is to embrace his views, his values, his vision, to embrace the way he loves people, to love people like him. You see, when we follow Jesus, we begin to see that following Jesus does make our life better. And when we follow Jesus, it allows us, it keeps us from becoming our own worst enemy. So here's what I'm encouraged to do. Because I don't want you to become your own worst enemy. I don't want you to undermine the relationships around you. I don't want you to undermine your marriage, your finances. I don't want you to undermine the life that you have so well planned out. We are all one bad decision away from completely undermining everything we've worked for. When it comes to following Jesus, it's aligning our values and our vision with what Jesus would have for us. So, our encouragement is to pay attention to your narratives. To pay attention to the narratives that you begin to create. To take captive every thought and rework them in such a way that they are obedient to Christ. Would you pray with me? God, we love you. And we thank you so much for the fact that you are a big God. And God, for me personally, I want to confess. God, it is so easy to create narratives that help me get my way. It's so easy for me to create narratives that help me to make excuses as to why I don't want to do things, or why I do want to do things, or why I shouldn't, or why I should, or why this or that. But God, I just ask that all of us, that we would begin to take captive every thought. And that we would run it in, that we would bend it and conform it in such a way so that it begins to mirror your value system. God, we love you. God, we need you. And we thank you. In Jesus' name.